CJAD 800.
Canadians are familiar with separatism, of course. Little Yellow Rose of Texas there to bring us back. Canadians are familiar with separatism thanks to Quebec, two referendums in 1980 and 1995. Last September, of course, a referendum held in Scotland whether or not to separate from the UK. In both cases, Canada and the UK stayed together. But how about Texas, the Lone Star State? Now, you might not know this, but yes, there is a separatist movement in Texas, a state many to consider to be, I think it's fair to say, one of the most, if not the most American of all the states, or at least that's the stereotype some of us have. As we wrap the show this week, we want to look at this movement, their message, why they want to separate from the United States, create their own country. In fact, it's kind of a back to the future scenario, because you might not know this, but there was a point in history when Texas was its own country, the Republic of Texas. My guest standing by on the line is Daniel Miller. Daniel, welcome to Viewpoints. Good to have you on the program, sir.
Thank you for having me on, Todd.
All right,
great intro music.
There we go. Well, you know what? I figured that you would like that because it was appropriate, I thought.
It is definitely appropriate, but that's when people hear and think about Texas, there's immediately imagery associated with it, and of course that song is one of those things that come to mind for people.
So let me ask you this: what's behind the movement here, in layman's terms, for you guys to secede and form your own country in Texas?
Well, the case that we have consistently made since our inception many years ago has been that Texas and the rest of the United States are on divergent paths. You look at the way Texans feel about things, whether it be politically, culturally, economically, and what we have found is that there is a massive disconnect between Texas and what goes on with the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., and frankly, the rest of the other states. So in our minds, it's not only time, it's well past time.
Now, how would this actually, in practice, Daniel, how would this happen? Is this at all, is it constitutionally legal? Is it feasible? How could you make this work?
Well, in short, here's what it boils down to from a legal framework standpoint is the United States Constitution is silent on the issue of independence of any of the states leaving the Union. So, therefore, what comes into play is the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, the last of the Bill of Rights, which reserves anything not granted specifically to the federal government, any rights to the states themselves. So that means that essentially what is in play here is the desires of the state. Then you have Article 1, Section 2 of the Texas Constitution, which says that all political powers inherent in the people, all free governments are founded on their authority and instituted for their benefit, and the people have at all times the inalienable right to reform, alter, or abolish their form of government in such manner as they may think expedient. Now, for us, that shakes down into something that you should be very familiar with, which is a referendum.
Mm-hmm. Of course. Now, I want to ask you this. We know, of course, Lyndon Johnson, a Democratic president from Texas, George W. Bush, a Republican president from Texas. Would the United States be the same without Texas? How would that work?
And that really is a question for the United States. The thing about it is that Texas has no identity crisis, whereas America does. I heard in your intro to the segment where you mentioned that Texas is what people envision America as. But the fact of the matter is that when Texans look at the rest of America, we don't see Texas. So, that the issue of Texas leaving the Union may force the rest of the American states to address their identity crisis. What are they and what do they want to be?
It's interesting as you're talking, Daniel. I'm curious, do you consider yourself to be American or do you consider yourself to be Texan?
Well, I'm an American in the sense that you're an American. We live on the North American continent, but I'm a Texan. I was born a Texan. I will be a Texan until the day that I die. And what you find is that cultural undercurrent running through Texas. When people have polled on this issue of do you consider yourself Texan or American, or Texan first or an American first, the Texan first crowd has consistently polled as one of the highest groups. So it's something that is definitely ingrained in us here.
Now, let's be realistic here. How fringe is this movement of yours? How many people actually support this kind of thing?
Well, and that's what's been interesting about this is that the opposition has tried to paint this as a fringe movement, but you go back to a recent poll at the tail end of 2014 that was sponsored by Reuters, a respected news agency. And when you broke those numbers down, of course, the headlines were that 25% of Americans believe that their state should secede. But if you look at the Texas numbers from that poll, what you find is that 54% of Republicans, about half of independents, and even over a third of Democrats felt that Texas should separate and become its own independent nation. The fact that these issues are talked about consistently in the media, in the halls of power in Austin, Texas, tells you that it is not a fringe idea. It is, in fact, part of the political mainstream, and in our minds, it's an inevitability.
And as you guys work toward that, I mean, we just came up to, not too long ago, the 100th anniversary of the end of the Civil War in your country that began, of course, when the southern states, the Confederacy, seceded. Are you worried at all about that, about violence or militancy here? Folks may be taking this too far.
Well, I will tell you that we hear this argument about the Civil War an awful lot, particularly from the opposition of those that are undecided. And what we have to remind people is that when you woke up this morning, the year on the calendar was 2015. This is not 1861. You look at this in the light of the overall global trend. At the end of World War II, there were 54 recognized countries. At the end of the 20th century, there were 192, and that number continues to grow. So, we're not looking at something through the lens of the 19th century. We're looking at something that is decidedly late 20th century and on into the 21st century, I guess, trend, if you'd like to call it that.
My guest has been Daniel Miller, president of the Texas Nationalist Movement. Daniel, thank you so much for sharing your viewpoints here on the show with us today. Great to have you.
Todd, thank you so much for having us to come see us in Texas sometime.
Absolutely, I will. That's going to do it for us here on Viewpoints. Another week is done. Thanks for taking some time to spend with us this weekend. Thanks to everyone who helped me put this show together as well. We'll be back right here again next weekend for another edition of Viewpoints.